Imagine looking at a photograph of someone you loved and believing it had stolen a piece of their soul. That was everyday fear for millions of people in the 1800s, and it wasn't a metaphor. Before cameras became normal, before selfies or social media, something far stranger was happening. People were terrified photography literally trapped parts of their identity. Not just hearts racing, but deep psychological terror rooted in how humans thought the world worked. Why? And how did something so familiar today become something feared just 150 years ago? Today, we're diving into the bizarre and emotional truth behind photography, and the Victorian fear that reality itself could be captured and taken away. Before we begin, hit like if you're curious about the strange ways humans use to understand reality, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next deep history story. To understand Victorian fear, we have to travel back thousands of years, long before cameras even existed. In many early cultures, shadows and reflections weren't just light, they were essences. To ancient Egyptians, Polynesians, and indigenous tribes across the Americas, a person's shadow or reflection was closely tied to their life force or spirit. If a mirror could show your face, what else could it capture? So when the first photographic technology, the daguerreotype, emerged in the 1830s, it didn't look like a machine. It looked like something mystical. This was not ignorance. This was a worldview where visual likeness equals personal essence. In fact, some people publicly refused to have their picture taken because they believed it could steal their luck, their power, or their soul itself. Anthropologists later found similar beliefs even in the early days of motion pictures. People demanded protections to prove cameras weren't stealing life. It sounds unbelievable today, until you realize, we live in a world shaped by imagery. They lived in a world defined by spiritual energy. Victorian England was a society obsessed with death and remembrance. Life expectancy was low. Funerals were public affairs, and losing a loved one was common. So when photography became more accessible, people didn't just make portraits, they made mourning pictures. Entire families would pose around the empty chair of someone who had died, frozen in time forever. But not everyone felt comforted. For many, these images were terrifying. There are documented cases, yes, documented, where families refused to keep photos because they believed the image held the person's spirit. One account from 1850s London tells of a mother who tore up a photograph of her daughter. Not out of anger, but fear. She believed the demon inside the lens was still in the photo. And it wasn't just superstition. Public newspapers wrote essays debating the possibility of spiritual theft. A popular magazine asked, "Does the camera steal the soul?" And hundreds wrote letters supporting the idea. Even Queen Victoria herself was known to commission portraits of her deceased relatives. But she was worried about where the spirit went. Photography didn't just capture faces. It captured something far deeper in people's minds. Memory, fear, identity. And human brains didn't treat these photos as objects. They treated them as part of the self.
As you can see, this fear wasn't just superstition, it was deeply tied to how people understood themselves and their world. Every photograph, every shadow captured in the lens, felt like it was taking a piece of their soul. Families hesitated to keep pictures. Mothers tore images of their loved ones. Even newspapers debated whether cameras could steal the spirit of a person. It might sound unbelievable today, but in their minds, this was very real. And in many ways, it mirrors our modern unease with technology, AI faces, deep fakes, and surveillance, where we still worry about how our likeness is captured and used.
So what changed? Why do people today happily post pictures of their faces every minute? Part of it was familiarity. Over time, cameras became less magical and more mechanical, and then digital. Humans tend to fear what they don't understand. But something else happened. Accountants, scientists, and photographers themselves began debunking myths. One photographer in 1860 wrote, "The daguerreotype is not a vessel of spirits, but merely a record of light." This shift from spiritual interpretation to mechanical explanation changed everything. Still, traces of that fear persist. Even today, some cultures avoid getting their photo taken without permission. Some religious communities still have theological objections. And even psychologists note a concept known as the uncanny self. the uneasy feeling of seeing your own face frozen in time. So while Victorians weren't afraid of selfies, their fear has echoes in how we react to deepfakes, face recognition, privacy concerns, i.e. imaging. People always fear the point where representation crosses into reality. And in the 1800s, the camera was exactly that point. It wasn't just a machine. It was the first time the external world permanently captured the inner self. In a world before screens and selfies, people faced something new. A mirror they couldn't control. A mirror that captured them forever. That's why Victorians were terrified of photography, not because it was evil, but because it challenged everything they felt about existence. If this fascinated you, hit subscribe. And join us every week for more stories about the strange, hidden, and forgotten corners of history. Thanks for watching.
So, what can we learn from this strange chapter of history? The camera was never evil. It simply challenged the way humans understood reality and identity. The fear faded as knowledge and familiarity grew, but the echoes of that fear are still with us today whenever technology captures something personal, something intimate. If this journey into the hidden fears of the past fascinated you, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us every week as we uncover more strange, forgotten, and often unbelievable stories from history.